Good afternoon and welcome to our 7th webinar. And that is the 7th webinar in a series of 10 webinars on female bodies and patriarchal inscriptions, an initiative of a recently established research program, Patriarchal Inscription, initiative set up by Toby Levin von Gleichen and myself, and hosted by the Arts and Humanities Research Institute, King's College London. And here at this point, let me gratefully acknowledge the tremendous support given by the college. And it is due to this support that we have Taylor working tirelessly, indispensably behind the scene, leading us through the webinar today. Thank you, Taylor, because as we all know, Microsoft Teams is not easy to negotiate and operate. What should I be saying before launching into the webinar? We have, as usual, a very simple sequence of introduction, presentation, and immediate question for clarification, expansion, followed by the next presentation. And at the end of the webinar, we will have a more general Q&A session. Microsoft Teams, unfortunately, does not allow for greater interaction. So I will have to ask you, the attendees, and welcome, to write in your comments, your feedback, your questions. There's a Q&A box on the right-hand side, and my colleague and co-convener, Comfort Momo, will be checking that Q&A box, and she will be moderating the Q&A session. As I was saying, again, our apology that there is no closer interaction. We will do our best to bring you into the feedback session, but should your question not be answered, should it not be possible to bring that into the session, we promise we will archive, store the questions, and we will bring that up in a later webinar, perhaps spring next year. Also, we intend publication as an outcome of the webinar series. So nothing will get lost. We most gratefully appreciate any feedback, comment you may have. As a chair, I will be as brief, succinct as possible to give our presenters as much as possible time to present and to answer a question. Any further information when it comes to the full program, when it comes to biographical details, contact details, you will be able to find that on the website of King's College. And if you look at Patriarchal Inscriptions, King's College London, you'll find the full program there. Moreover, this is the 7th webinar, and although we know many of us have been with us from the start, there are those who join us for the first time today. We are very, very happy to be able to tell you that we have a YouTube site that's part of King's College domain, and Taylor will be putting the link up in the Q&A box. So for those wishing to visit some of our past webinars, the YouTube site will give you that possibility. And again, any further feedback you have, we are grateful for that. Those who have been with us know that the way that we've organized the webinars has been around particular themes. So we have considered the impact of democracy, diminishing of democracy, rising populism, the pandemic moment, the impact on FGM. We have looked at the very complex issues surrounding ethical, cultural relativism, the complex relationship between culture and legal intervention. We have explored the spheres of intimacy, invested emotion that can contribute or serve the sustaining of a particular practice by focusing on mother-daughter relationship. And last week, we framed the discussion in terms of FGM industry and its critics. Today's webinar is considering issues surrounding circumcision in relation to gender identity. If Simone de Beauvoir talks about women as being made rather than born, then what is the contribution here, this particular practice in the making of gender identity, male and female? And we are very pleased to have been, offered the very generous presentations from a very distinguished panel of speakers from the US, but also here from Europe, to consider gender identity, the making of gender identity in terms of different backgrounds, disciplines, methodologies, positionalities, perspective, but also different relationship and investment in relation to the subject matter under discussion. So thank you to all the presenters who followed our invitation. I shall start by inviting Professor Mary Nyangweso. Mary is Associate Professor and J. Woolard Helen Peer Distinguished Chair of Religious Study at East Carolina University. And Mary, sort of in keeping with the theme of the webinar, is looking at circumcisions as inscriptions of gender, and that is implications of FGM eradication or sustenance. Mary, if I can hand over to you.
Yeah. Thank you. So I'm going to go ahead and share my PowerPoint, and thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this team, this great team. And so, just in a minute. Okay. All right. Okay, so the title of my presentation is Circumcision as Inscriptions of Gender, Implications of Fgmc, Eradication or Sustenance. And so I start my argument by looking at a few things. Number one, I'm going to look at how gender is inscribed in various communities. The main argument being the debate about eradication and sustenance of circumcision has implications on the individual process of members of these communities. I'm going to use a theory, feminist theory, particularly looking at intersectionality and how FGM is depicted in the larger context of socialization process. And I'm going to look at FGM as a bodily mark, which essentially inscribes gender and how it's performed in effort to perfect what is known as masculinity or femininity in the different communities. And of course, I'll argue that nonconformity is consequential for the individual and the larger community as perceived in these communities. And then I'll look at implications of eradication in terms of maybe decline and resistance and changes that happen with regard to bodily marks as society adjusts to these changes. And what are the implications of sustenance? What if we left FGM alone? What are some of the changes that are taking place in terms of those who want to sustain it? So bodily modifications is defined as altering the body and its appearance for a variety of reasons. And FGM is not the only one, only body modification that we're talking about. There are many other, and they are often done for culture or tradition. Life transitions or rites of passage, FGM falls in that category. Either to belong to a group, so for identity purposes or status, for religion and for aesthetics, and of course, there are other reasons people engage in bodily modifications. And there are a few examples of bodily modifications, beginning with tattoos and scarifications and foot binding. All these are some of the examples. Piercings, plastic surgery, as is often done in modern society. And so we have many examples of bodily modifications, including teeth modification, etc., etc. Now, circumcision as a bodily modification is performed for various reasons. It's a rite of passage into adulthood, manhood or womanhood in communities where it's performed. It's done to maintain fidelity or the control of female sexual desire, to ensure paternity, and argued to help calm the female personality. And there are many reasons given for that, for aesthetics, hygiene, and to belong to a community. And that's very important, as often as we may want to look aside, to enhance fertility. And therefore, some have argued, as Eki and Kanyemi, prevent clitoris from growing like a penis, or a woman's honor is dependent on being circumcised, and therefore there are many reasons for why circumcision is performed in various communities. And others, of course, have always cited religious injunctions. We have indigenous explanations for that, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. It's associated with some major religions like Islam and sometimes even Christianity. The theoretical framework I'm going to use to discuss bodily modifications mostly is the feminist theory, which asserts bodily integrity. And I'm going to draw from Butler, Bodo, and Dawkins, who've talked about how bodies are constructed, trained, modified, altered, based on the norms in the communities within which they are essentially the modifications happen. Butler argues gender is a performance that is enacted each day through actions, speeches, and appearances. It's something that is enacted, and that explains the origin and the reasons for bodily modifications, including circumcision. Now, circumcision's goal is essentially perceived in this community as a way to purify individuals and the entire society of impurities and dirt that is often associated with sex or sexual activities or sexual pleasure. Interesting to see that that is perceived as dirty, and ways of explaining that. I'm also going to draw from cultural relativism as a way to argue for sustenance of the practice. And the cultural relativism argues that rights and rules about morality are encoded and depended on a particular social cultural context, and therefore the culture knows better what is right for its own individuals. And I'll also draw a little bit from intersectionality as a framework. Yes?
Mary, can I intervene? Are you changing your slides?
I am. Are you able to see or not?
No, it's staying with theoretical framework.
Oh, so you're not seeing the words on it?
All so far is we are with theoretical framework.
Okay. Well, I am going through point by point, and it comes on.
All right. Yeah, as long as fine. Yeah.
Does it show?
yeah, if this is what you want to do, then that's fine. But obviously, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So you're not seeing at all? Oh.
Sorry, Mary, if you just want to go into, are you in full screen mode?
Yes, it's a full screen mode.
Okay, I think when you've shared it, you've shared another window because we haven't seen you move through any of your slides. I'm so sorry to interrupt what you're doing. If you wanted to stop sharing and then reshare it again, that might work.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Well, no, sorry for
That's
that.
right.
I assumed everything was okay. Let me see.
Okay, to the attendees, bear with us just for a moment, please. Thanks.
Okay, let me try to do it again.
Yes.
Can you see anything now?
We're seeing the slide that we've just seen.
Okay.
Theoretical framework setting out your theory.
Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing and do it again.
Sorry about that. If not, then leave it at that slide and talk us through it.
Oh God, technology.
There is that, yeah.
Can you see anything?
We are back to the same slide. Look, why don't you leave it at that? Because it sets out your various points: human rights, cultural relativism, and so on, intersectionality, and talk us through it. Because yeah, otherwise we'll take up too much time trying.
Oh, so you are able to see that those cultural relativism and intersectionality?
Yes, we see this framework that you're setting out. Yes.
Okay. All right. So I was essentially just sharing the theoretical framework that I use in my discussion for this particular discussion. Do you see the next slide now?
Gender inscriptions. Yes.
Okay. Well, so after drawing from those theoretical and analytical frameworks, I focus on the socialization process. And I argue that gender inscription happens during this time. Of course, as a sociologist, I look at how socialization process takes place and how the society functions in terms of sanctioning those aspects of socialization. And FGM is one way in which the society inscribes gender through rites of passage. Of course, rites of passage in African communities is a way to socialize the individual to become a full member of the community. As a renowned scholar, John S. Beatty, has argued, rites of passage they make, they create, and they produce the individual. They offer the individual that transition process from one stage to another in order to be incorporated into society. Beatty uses the word I am because we are, and since we are, therefore I am. And Beatty is talking about that incorporation of becoming your individuality subsumed into the individuality of the entire society. And so that individuality essentially disappears once you go through this process of rites of passage. Now, FGM is related to other patriarchal practices in especially African communities, things like widow inheritance, child marriage, domestic violence, polygamy. So you cannot really discuss FGM in isolation. You have to look at it in terms of how it fits or connects to other practices within a patriarchal society. An uncircumcised woman is unworthy of marriage, and therefore she's often ostracized if she does not accept to be circumcised. Men are also socialized to traditionally accept or prefer chaste women in order to guarantee paternity, and circumcision is one way to ensure that. As you probably all know, that before circumcision, virginity is checked in some communities to ensure that the girl who is being circumcised is actually virgin, and thereafter they prepare to get married. That process of socialization is intended to create you, to give you that identity that makes you a member of the community. Now, this is not an isolated case. If you look at the history of chastity and control and of female control, it goes way, way back into ancient Rome, where slaves had metal rings passed through the labia minora to prevent procreation. Women in medieval England who wore chastity belts, clitoridectomy was practiced in Britain as a way to manage epilepsy, sterility, and masturbation. All this intended to control female sexuality. There's no evidence of controlling male masturbation. And even if there were, it's not as aggressively done, or was never aggressively done as female sexuality was controlled. It was until the 21st century when we have the World Health Organization and the Amnesty International intervene by emphasizing human rights. It is at this point we see FGM being rendered a violation of a girl's or a woman's right, leading to legislations that required the abolishing and criminalization of female genital cutting. So this is something that has been ongoing for a very long time. Now, sanctioning of these inscriptions is very important, and we see that there are religious ways in which gender inscription has been sanctioned over time. FGM essentially has been sanctioned in indigenous communities using mythologies, the myth of bisexuality and hermaphroditism. FGM is perceived as the way to perfect femininity and masculinity of a child in most indigenous communities. Something that I found out in my research, that this mythology of bisexuality and hermaphroditism is very rampant in many African communities, even though the narrative is very disjointed depending on which community you look at. And of course, we have monotheistic religious ways of sanctioning these gender inscriptions. Abraham's circumcision as a way to sanction male circumcision, and the assumption that Hagar, who was Abraham's slave and mother to his first child, was also circumcised as a way to sanction female circumcision. Others have argued that Mary's virginity implies she must have been circumcised. There's no way they would have known that she was a virgin unless she was circumcised, given where she was located. We know in Islam, Prophet Muhammad discouraged female circumcision, but Ali recommended it for women who are good women should essentially do it. So let me talk a little bit about the myth of bisexuality, just to summarize, and how this essentially is really perceived as a way to inscribe gender. So according to this mythology, which is found in many African communities, the creation of humans is perceived to be, all humans are created to be as androgynous, bisexual tendencies, and we all have it, it's assumed. And when a child is born, he or she is born with two souls, and these two souls are inhabited by an evil power known as one soul. This spirit causes infertility. And the power of one soul must be destroyed, and the only way to destroy it is to remove the prepuce of the male genitals, which is in which one soul resides, and to remove the clitoris of the female through circumcision. These stories are narrated by Griol. And so male and female circumcision essentially are perceived as necessary in these communities to define the masculinity and the femininity of both boys and girls. And therefore, if you are not circumcised, then you are going to encounter several misfortunes because of the curses of the elders in the community and the curses of the ancestors, and the gods will not be happy with you, and therefore you are unlikely to go through infertility issues or stillbirth or death of your siblings or death of your spouses or incurable diseases. And all this will be punishment for you refusing to go through that. So a way of sanctioning that. And of course, in monotheistic religions, of course, such an individual is perceived to be violating religious sanctions. You are not a good Muslim if you do not perform female genital cutting. Remember, the Quran doesn't say anything about circumcision, but all this is later on implied in a way to justify this particular practice. Now, in these communities where this mythology is very rampant, bisexuality and androgeneity are characteristics that are perceived to be unique to the gods. There's the belief in the existence of gods, Maulisa, who is essentially a female deity, male sky goddess, god or goddess, who is perceived as an inseparable twins. And so when we are all born, it's perceived that we have both sides to this. The Mau, which is the creative goddess of the moon, and the Lisa, which is the brotherly half, merge into one being. And so human beings are born with these tendencies, and through circumcision, we are able to perfect whatever gender we want to possess in society. And so circumcision is a way to take out those characteristics that are not human, that are only preserved for God. And so when bodily marks get contested, and we know female genital cutting has been contested for many reasons, health concerns, and of course issues of gender inequality that are implied in that. And I'm not going to go over the health concerns, as we all know that there are many, and Momo adapted this from some of your work. And the short-term effects of FGM and the long-term effects of FGM, reasons for why female genital cutting as a bodily mark has been contested in modern society. And of course, for this reason, it's considered, some have argued it should be eradicated. But at the same time, we have other arguments for sustenance, who arguing that human rights and moral universalism have perceived FGM as a violation of human rights, and therefore every individual should be is entitled to protection from violence and cultural practices that are harmful, like FGM. But those who've argued for sustenance have adopted the group's rights or cultural relativism, which argues that rights and rules about morality are encoded in the community within which the practice is performed. And so if a community or a culture thinks that is something that is good for them, they want to keep it. But those who've argued for sustenance have also gone ahead and say, well, if health issues are an issue, we can modify it. We can change the way we practice female circumcision. Maybe we can perform ceremonial pinpricks or the nick in a way to be sensitive to the cultural and religious values of the communities that perform it. Coleman is one of the doctors in the United States who encountered this issue here in North Carolina, where she essentially advocated for a nick and pinprick, and argues that it is essentially a less severe form of circumcision, even though circumcision is not good. I think this is not harmful. So kind of advocating for it. And of course, those who've argued for eradication, there are implications for it. Mexler has argued that, yes, because of the campaign women have waged against FGM, there is we can see some decline taking place. When you look at East Africa, for a study that was done between 1990 to 2017, East Africa's decline has actually happened from 71% of those who have been performing female genital cutting to 8%. So we can see some kind of decline taking place in North Africa from 58% to 14% between 1990 and 2015. In West Africa, 74% to 23% in the study that took place between 1996 and 2017. So the implication that I'm arguing here is that when we look at the resistance and modification of the practice, resistance takes place when the practice goes underground. And we all know that in most communities where the practice has been criminalized, either there has been that decline or there has been a resistance or the persistence of the practice. And the reasons for the persistence of the practice is because of the culture and because of the status, because of the identity that is associated with the FGM. And so we have underground practices that are performed where very young girls are circumcised, sometimes babies are circumcised in order to evade the law, or the kidnapping of girls and they get circumcised without really even parents' consent. And we've had situations where women have actually sought out FGM, even when they know it is illegal. They have sought it because they want to have that status. But then, of course, we have the modification component, whereas in countries like the United States, and I think in Britain as well, where some parents have traveled abroad with their children so that they can go and perform the practice out of the country to evade the law, or they've invited excisers, secretly to perform the practice in their own homes. And we've had some doctors performing it actually in hospitals as a way of modifying and trying to evade the law and maybe also evade the practices, the consequences that come with the health issue. So in conclusion, I would like to say bodily marks are embedded in cultural and religious values, and they are shaped by social structures, and the patriarchal social structures are very, very important in defining FGM and other bodily marks. To eradicate or sustain them depends on the relevance of this practice for the group, whether it means status or identity and whether the identity is more important than the health concerns. Yes, we have social change that is taking place, and that has, of course, impacted the practice in terms of eradication or sustenance and modifications, and we have the academic discourses and debates that have also impacted this particular issue. But the success of social agents depends on whether this issue can be consulted with the communities that practice it, to understand the meanings behind the practice and whether they're willing to change that. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Mary. You promised us a difficult and insightful presentation, and you have given us this, and that is that inscription of gender circumcision must be considered in the context of socialization, a broader complex web of, as you say, socially assigned, policed, or imposed behaviors and roles. And that is what you perhaps didn't address as much in your presentation. You gave us in your abstract for your presentation that in order to bring about change, we have to enter the frame of reference of sustainers, and one wonders about, you know, the implication of that. Who are those who would enter into a constructive conversation with sustainers, given the problematical issue of agency, and agency, you know, that could be a submissive, a coerced, acquiescent agency. But there is a great deal here to be discussed, and I've noticed that the Q&A box has already plenty of questions. But just before handing over to Comfort to take over the brief question time, my apologies again. I know that it wasn't very satisfactory. We didn't have the full screen mode, and we promised to do better next time around. Apology for the technical mishap, but I think the presentation made up for that. Comfort, can I hand over to you for a couple of questions, please?
You're muted.
Unmute, please.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Mary, presentation, and thank you, Maria. Yes, we've got one question and two contributions. I think the contribution is from the same person, and I'll just quickly read it out. It says the Jewish of Ethiopian origin also circumcise their daughters. Yeah. It is not just some Muslims or Christians who claim a religious justification. And I think the same person continue and say, I've never heard, I think when you mentioned about Mary and virginity, she said, he or she said, I've never heard this idea that Mary was circumcised as a way of asserting her virginity. But it does not make sense. It does make some sense, she said, since there are some ancient reference to Jewish cutting females also. As I mentioned earlier, according to this person, the Jewish from Ethiopia who claim descent from King David and Bathsheba still claim religious as a justification for FGM. So this is this person's contribution, and I would like you to elaborate on that. And the second question obviously comes from me. We're saying bodily modification. Where do we draw the line? People do all sorts of things to their bodies. Like you've mentioned, the what's they called? Plastic surgery, tattoo, and so on. Where do we draw the line? So I'll leave you to answer these two questions or to elaborate more.
Okay, thank you so much for those wonderful questions. It is very true. I think I was probably rushing for time purposes I didn't really talk much about Judaism and Christianity and Islam. Of course, indigenous religions, all of them justifying female genital cutting. Yes, there is a community within the Jewish community that practice and justify female circumcision. In fact, there is a serious study that was done to explain that. And so the connection between Mary being circumcised explains the fact that she is Jewish, and she was Jewish, and because she was Jewish communities were practicing female genital cutting, she must have been circumcised in order for them to know that she was a virgin before she conceived. So it is an assertion that draws from that. And you're right, Jewish of Ethiopia, Jews that we find within Ethiopia, and we have some in Uganda as well, practice female circumcision as well. So there is when we look at religious sanctioning of FGM, it draws from all these monotheistic religions and indigenous religions, and to explain, or patriarchy, to explain the control of sexuality, even if it's not FGM. And of course, FGM becomes a very good example of controlling female sexuality. Your question about the bodily modifications and where to draw the line, I think it depends, because when you look at bodily modifications around the world, including tattoos, including piercings, including the neck rings, as I showed earlier, there are a foot binding, etc. There are various reasons and justifications for all those practices. I think the line is drawn when it is perceived to be harmful. And that is tricky, because who is it that is perceiving it to be harmful? In the communities within which it is practiced, that harm is part of growing up. That harm, to be circumcised, to shed the blood, to experience the pain, is part of what it means to grow up, to become a woman, to learn to experience pain and be able to perceive it. So I think the line is drawn when a community itself decides to sanction it, to eradicate it, because it is harmful.
Thank you so much. I think in view of time, I'll hand over back to Maria. We still have more questions which we can deal with later on. Thank you, Mary.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mary. This conversation will continue. Thank you, Comfort. And we will now move from the social constructiveness of inscribed gender to intervention, and that is plastic surgery. And I'm glad to have Mona with us after initial technical difficulties from the, which university is it? The Northwestern University Feinberg School of Medicine. And this is Mona Asha. Yes. Division of Plastic and Reconstructive Surgery, Department of Surgery. And Mona is speaking on behalf of a number of colleagues who have considered issue of the extent of knowledge or lack thereof when it comes to plastic surgeons' familiarity with FGM and cutting in the United States. Mona, if I can hand over to you.
Yes, of course. Let me just share my screen. Okay, can you see my presentation?
Yes, we can. Perfect.
Okay, great. Hello, good morning, good afternoon. My name is Mona Asha. I am a plastic surgery trainee in Chicago, and I will be talking about plastic surgeon familiarity with female genital mutilation and cutting in the United States. We have no disclosures. So a little bit of background, approximately 500,000 girls and women are estimated to be at risk for Fgmc in the United States. Fgmc can result in acute and lifelong morbidity and mortality. The morbidity may be psychological, medical, and surgical. Surgical provider awareness is very important. Patients mainly present to OBGYNs rather than plastic surgeons, and plastic surgeons have limited experience in taking care of these patients. I'm sure most of you are familiar with this, but I wanted to briefly discuss the WHO classification of FGM. There are 4 types. Type 1 is removal of the glans clitoris. Type 2 is removal of the glans clitoris and labia minora. Type 3 is called infibulation, which involves almost complete closure of the vaginal canal. And type 4 is miscellaneous. So as you can see, FGM represents a diverse set of presentations with soft tissue injury and loss, scarring, and nerve injury, which is important to consider when these patients present to plastic surgeons for care. The aims of our study were threefold. First, we wanted to appraise plastic surgeon knowledge of and experience with FGMC through the dissemination of an online survey. Second, we wanted to compare survey responses of the plastic surgeons to data from a similar survey that was sent out to OBGYN respondents and compare both of those. And third, we wanted to propose possible educational tools to increase provider awareness of FGMC. So our methods. We created a survey that was disseminated to a cohort of plastic surgeons that are members of the American Society of Plastic Surgeons between January and May of 2020. The survey was developed based on prior literature and expert opinion. We chose to send the survey through ASPS because it is the largest organization of plastic and reconstructive surgeons, representing 8,000 surgeons worldwide. It includes both attending surgeons and trainees. A similar survey was deployed to ACOG, which is the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. ACOG is also the largest organization of OBGYN, and it contains over 60,000 members. For our analysis, we performed descriptive statistics, a regression to assess the outcome of education and training, and compared the responses between plastic surgeons and OBGYNs. So here are our results. We had 363 plastic surgery respondents, resulting in about a 10% response rate. Because of this response rate, we did perform a non-responder analysis. And basically what that entails is comparing the responders to the non-responders to see if there were any difference between the two groups. There were more females who responded to the survey, but otherwise our group of respondents were representative of the overall general ASPS cohort. There were also 491 OBGYN respondents, and they had a similar 10% response rate. This map here is an illustration of the counts of respondents from various areas in the United States, as well as the percentages on top of respondents from each area. So as you can see, most of our respondents were from the Midwest and Northeast United States. In terms of the demographics, this is a table that represents the majority demographic for each variable. The majority of our respondents were males. The majority were also white. And we had a younger cohort with most of our respondents being under 35 years of age. In addition, most of our respondents were at the attending training level. We also surveyed respondents about the practice setting, type, area, and years in practice, which were largely representative of the ASPS membership, as I mentioned earlier. Most respondents worked in an urban setting. They came from either an academic or solo practice, and most of them reported as practicing cosmetic plastic surgery, general plastic surgery, or breast surgery. Again, as you can see here on the table on the right, most of our respondents were on the younger side, with the majority of them reporting 1 to 10 years of experience. With regards to the question, have you received any kind of education and training on Fgmc? Only 17% indicated yes, that they had. This was not significantly different when we grouped them as attendings versus trainees. On the regression analysis, so the outcome of the regression was indicating yes to this question. The important variables on the multivariate analysis were attending versus resident. So the attendings were more likely to answer yes to this question, and respondents who reported that they routinely performed genital surgery also indicated, or was also a significant predictor of answering yes to this question. In terms of the question, are you familiar with the WHO classification? Only 29 or 8.5% of respondents indicated yes. This also was not significant when we stratified according to attendings versus trainees. In terms of the question, are you aware of any clinical guidelines or legal requirements pertaining to Fgmc, which most states have legal requirements in place? The overwhelming majority said that they were uncertain. This also was not statistically significant when we stratified between attendings and trainees. When we surveyed asking respondents where Fgmc is practiced, the majority of them believed that it was practiced in Africa and Asia. in the top two answers are bolded. In terms of why respondents believed FGMC was performed, the majority believed it was a cultural tradition or to control women's sexuality, and those top two answers are outlined in bold as well. But as you can see, answers were pretty much all across the board. Most respondents believe that FGMC can occur repeatedly throughout a woman's child and adult life. However, over 1/4 of respondents, as you can see in the bottom row, admitted to being uncertain. We surveyed respondents about immediate physical risks of FGMC. Most of them believed that it would result in genital and reproductive tract infections, as well as damage to the urethra. But as you can see here, respondents pretty much selected all of these risks. In terms of long-term risk associated with FGMC, most respondents believe that it would result in sexual dysfunction and chronic vulvar clitoral pain, as well as urethral fistulas and strictures. But again, as you can see, most respondents selected pretty much all of these answers. When respondents were asked if they have ever treated a patient with FGMC, only 21 respondents, or 6.3% of our cohort, answered yes. When asked how many times they have encountered FGMC affected patients over the clinical experience, most, over approximately 80%, said 0. 10% were uncertain, and among those who did, the majority was 1 to 5 encounters. When asking what kind of treatments were performed if FGMC patients were treated, most of the respondents indicated that they performed some kind of scar revision, with the second most popular answer being clitoral reconstruction. I wanted to include a photograph here of clitoral reconstruction. This is not a photograph from our practice. This was a photograph I found in the literature, and the citation is at the bottom. On the left-hand side, you can see a preoperative photograph of a patient with type 2 FGMC per the WHO classification. And on the right, you can see a 12-month postoperative photograph after clitoral reconstruction with a full-thickness mucosal graft that was used. In terms of the plastic surgeon's role in the care of FGMC patients, the overwhelming majority of our cohort believe that plastic surgeons can significantly help treat surgical morbidities associated with FGMC. When specifically asked what the role is of plastic surgeons in FGMC care, the top 3 answers were to collaborate with multidisciplinary care teams, learn how to diagnose and treat complications, and educate healthcare providers to be able to diagnose and appropriately treat FGMC patients. Most of our respondents were interested in learning more about FGMC. In terms of what educational tools they believed were helpful, the top 3 answers were online modules, guest speakers who had FGMC or an expert in FGMC, and lectures. When asked, so these are the results from the OBGYN cohort and the comparison with the plastic surgery cohort. And as you can see, which is not surprising, the OBGYN physicians had much more experience, familiarity, and care of FGMC patients. These results were statistically significant. In addition, the OBGYN respondents were a little bit older than our cohort. They were mainly female, and they had more years of clinical practice. The limitations of our study are most certainly the low response rate. We tried to overcome that by performing the non-responder analysis, which indicated that our response cohort is pretty similar to the ASPS cohort. There is no validated knowledge assessment tool for healthcare providers on Fgmc. So when we were developing our survey, we wanted to perform a careful question review and chronologic placement of the questions in the survey. So it is evident from our research that there is a clear knowledge gap of Fgmc among plastic surgeons. Approximately 80% of the plastic surgery respondents had no prior Fgmc training or education. They did indicate that online modules and guest speakers would be the most helpful learning modalities. And this is highly relevant and feasible given the current virtual educational climate where a lot of in-person educational didactics have been converted to a virtual format. OBGYN respondents had significantly more education and encounters regarding Fgmc. Given the multidisciplinary needs of these patients, it is important for plastic surgeons to be familiar with their care. And we propose and advocate for the development of multidisciplinary clinics and referral systems to provide more streamlined care. This can be done by fostering relationships with OBGYN colleagues. Moving forward, we can conclude by saying that plastic surgeons need and want to improve their knowledge of Fgmc. Plastic surgeons can also offer expertise in genital reconstruction, aesthetics, scar management, and nerve reconstructions for Fgmc victims. Thank you very much.
Mona, thank you very much. I think you made very clear the so woeful lack of knowledge, expertise, and training when it comes to plastic surgery. And I just wondered, as you were asking about what might be the most useful sources of information and knowledge, I mean, I was wondering about patients themselves, those women who seek out plastic surgery, and what that relationship might be, how much they would reveal of themselves or express what it is that they required of a plastic surgeon. You know, a closer kind of understanding of the nature, relationship between those surgeons who actually, you know, performed surgery and the patient seeking out, a surgeon, which is a very, you know, assertive agency on the part of women.
Certainly.
Right. Thank you very much, Mona. Comfort, can I hand over to you to unmute?
Yes, I have. Thank you so much, Mona. Thank you, Maria. I'll quickly, Toby put into comments, and then I have a question for you, Mona. I'll quickly read Toby's. Toby said, I'm uneasy with the figures given regarding decrease in geographical area in East Africa, North Africa, and West Africa, which appears too broad, and wonder what Mary might say about this, namely that practice are specific to ethnic groups. That's her comment. And then she goes on to say, I'd like to praise the introduction of myth, which deserves closer study. Yeah, so that is the comment. We don't have much questions on the box, but I have a question for you, Mona. As somebody who have worked around FGM for over 20-something years, I performed average of 1 defibrillation per week, right? At my clinic when I was at Guy's and St. Thomas's, and I did that for over 20 years. And what tends to come up is, can you fully reconstruct the clitoris? Because people will argue and say what has been removed can never be put back. So what are your comments around that? Because if the clitoris has been removed completely, obviously you cannot reconstruct it, but you can argue that, I'll leave that to you. What's your comment on that?
Yes. So I just want to preface this by saying that I haven't had much experience in personally in clitoral reconstruction as well as care of FGMC patients, but I do believe that, you know, it's a very individualized process, and it really depends on what the patient is missing, how much scar tissue is present, if the reconstructive options are available. Certainly, I know that we create we do clitoral reconstruction for transgender patients, patients who are transitioning from male to female. So I have read about that being done as well. So I would say that complete clitoral reconstruction can certainly happen, but once again, it definitely depends on each patient. It should be approached on a case-by-case basis, depending on the physical exam, the patient's desires, the patient's expectations. All of those things need to be taken into consideration.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. And perhaps some of the questions that were then directed at Barry will park until the end of our webinar, our session. So please prepare yourself, dear presenters, for more interrogation. Thank you so much, Mona.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
We are moving on and actually back to consideration of legal medical interventions here in the UK in terms of identity, and that is identity both as collective and as individual identity. And here to speak about this is Dr. Janice Daly. And Janice sort of brings sort of fantastic combination of expertise anthropology, and she's a student of doctoral student anthropology at the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology in Halle, expertise in anthropology and legal training. She's just been appointed a lecturer, assistant lecturer in civil law in the Faculty of Law at the University of Malta. So, Janice, if I can hand over to you, FGM and other genital interventions as markers of collective and or individual identity. Janice. Janice, are you unmuted? Are we having a problem? Can you unmute?
Oh, hi, Janice. Sorry to interrupt. It seems that even if you've unmuted yourself, we're still having some issues with your audio coming through.
Taylor, do you want to work with Janice on that, and we go to Mariama and then come back to Janice, or do you think you can resolve that?
Yes, we might do that if that's okay. Sorry about that, everybody.
Okay, so apology. In this case, we give Taylor and Janice time to resolve their technical issue. And Mariama, you have to prepare yourself to present. And here I'm introducing Mariama Diallo. Mariama is a program director for African Initiative, and has conducted a superb sort of a pilot study, if I understand correctly, a qualitative study, examining the emotional and behavioral consequences and aftermath among African immigrants living in the US, in New York City. So depression, anxiety, PTSD, but also coping and recommendations for clinicians. So a case study conducted among African immigrants in New York City. Mariama, we are much looking forward to your presentation. Please.
Thank you so much. You hear me, right?
Hear you perfectly.
Okay, so I'm going to share my presentation. Do you see it?
Yes, it's coming. Yes, it's not full screen yet, but it's there.
How about now?
Not perfect.
Okay.
Thank you. Perfect. Thanks.
All right. So thank you so much for having me. My name is Mariama, and I am a licensed social worker from New York. So I want to share a study that I have conducted here in New York last summer, and the purpose of the study was really to explore, as Maria said, to explore the emotional and behavioral consequences of female genital mutilations among African women living in New York City. So who are we? Where do I work? So I work at Sanctuary for Families. We are a non-for-profit organization based in New York City and providing services to survivors of gender-based violence, including female genital mutilations. So we are in all the 5 boroughs in New York, for those who know New York City, and we provide clinical services, legal representation, and economic empowerment. So in the clinical department, we have adult program and children, and we provide psychotherapy. We do a lot of advocacy and outreach education within the community, targeting not only service providers to do education around these different types of gender-based violence, but also to reach out to survivors of this type of gender-based violence or people who are at risk of this type of violence. So when I say type of violence, it could be female genital mutilation that I'm going to talk about today. Could be domestic violence, family violence, and intimate partner violence. And we have clients from the LGBTQ community who are also victims of gender-based violence. And we have also clients who are victims of labor or sexual trafficking. So I think I'm not going to focus a lot on the statistics, because I think if I remember, it was Mary who did some of these statistics in her presentation. But for me, it's very important to see how high the number of women and girls around the world. 2 million women and girls have undergone FGM. And this is a study from UNICEF in 2016. Although, you know, there are some countries that have been successful in fighting against FGM and ending FGM, as Mary, you know, spoke in her presentation, but the cases are still high in many countries. And we know it is a global issue because it is happening in not only in Africa, even though my study, you know, target only African women, but it is happening in the Middle East, it is happening in Asia, but it is also happening in the Western world, including the United States. And that's why I'm talking about this today. So in the US, it is estimated that about 500,000 women have undergone FGM or are at risk of FGM. Again, this is a study that was done in 2016, and I have some, you know, limitations about this study also because of the way the study was done. I think it was not really inclusive, and I'm wondering if in the US we have maybe more than 500,000 women. So why the study that I did? The study I did was really because of what I have heard from the women and girls I have been working with here in New York, right? There is a limited services for survivors of FGM in the United States in general, and a very limited sometimes services that are trauma-informed care. I have many clients who have reported feeling maybe re-traumatized when they are interacting with service providers out there, not only because maybe the service providers are doing this willingly, but because of the lack of understanding of the practice itself. So the background of the study a little. So because I hear a lot from my client about some of the psychological impact that they are going through, then I went to the existing literature, right? I start to look at what is there, what people have been doing, how much research have been done around FGM. And I found that there was a gap in the literature because the majority of the research, you know, spoke about the physical consequences and the overview of the practice, like where it is happening, who is doing it, why people are doing it, but also like how to end this practice. This is what I was seeing the most in the literature. But the psychological impact, there were some research, but it's a very limited research, right? So then the purpose of the research was really to explore, as I said, the emotional and behavioral consequences of FGM, hoping that the findings will assist service providers in the United States in getting a better understanding of the psychological impact of having undergone FGM, and also, you know, develop and foster a very meaningful healing environment for survivors of female genital mutilations. So the participants, all of them were from West Africa, Guinea, Mali, Burkina Faso, Gambia, and Nigeria. And they were all Muslim and Christian and speak English or French, and the ages were between 31 and 55. So this was a very small sample because it was a pilot study. That means there were limitations, and these findings cannot be generalized because the sample was very small. The recruitment was done through flyers and snowball sampling through the recruitment. And what did I find after analyzing the data? For sure, some of the findings confirm something that was already in some of the research, like FGM as a gender identity. Many of the participants spoke about why FGM happened to them. What are the justifications they have been given to undergo FGM? Decreasing sexual sensitivity was one of the common justifications, and preserving virginity. And being virgin, in fact, among the participants was an identity, because girls who get who are subjected to FGM, especially the type 3, which is amputation, it is expected that they're going to be virgin when they get married. So that is an identity. The virginity is an identity. And then later on, the identity is that status of being a very well-respected member of society. They spoke about that a lot. And FGM also was linked to family honor, because someone who is not subjected to FGM may not be able to fit in society, may not able to fit in that community. And just to quote one of the participants who said, FGM is a way to become a woman, so that you are not be a bilakoro. So bilakoro, that term was from her dialect, which means a whore. People make fun at you if you are not subjected to FGM. You can't fit in, and it is a shame for the family. Before coming to the United States, I had a friend who was not subjected to FGM, but the community humiliated her. So you don't want to be that girl. You are waiting and excited for your turn to come. And also, they spoke a lot about how it happened. The way it happened, it was a lot of deception and betrayal, because none of the participants from this study was told clearly about what is going to happen the day they were going for the procedure. Some of them were told, oh, we're going to visit your aunt, or, oh, we're going to buy something. So they find out it's really about FGM when they got to the place, and they felt betrayed and deceived. So the findings also highlight the mental health consequences, right? So to measure the mental health consequences, I used evidence-based assessment tools, which is the PCL5 that can measure symptoms of PTSD, and the Beck Depression Inventory that measure depressive symptoms. And all the participants, it doesn't matter the age when the procedure happened, they all presented with symptoms of depression, anxiety, and PTSD. They all, most of them, not all, maybe 90% of the participants spoke about feelings of loss and low self-esteem, feeling powerless. So the powerlessness was during the procedure, or what happened following the procedure, like when they cannot protect some family members, like younger sisters. They felt very scared during the procedure because most of these women have experienced the FGM in a group. So because they haven't been told what was about to happen, some of them, when they were waiting in the waiting area, they hear other people scream, and that created a very scary feeling. One of the participants shared this quote. I'm going to read it verbatim. It's painful to feel less than a woman. You feel powerless, and FGM is causing a lot of problems with couples. God created you and gave you something that makes you a woman. They are taking it away. It will never come back. And they tell you this is what makes you a woman. You will never know how it would have been, and no one will give you an answer. They took away one of the things that made you a woman. So even though the participant, they have the feelings of loss, they feel sad that what have been taken will not come back, they find ways to cope with the trauma. I found them very resilient and have different ways of coping with the trauma. The hope for the future and accepting themselves was one of the ways they were coping with what happened. Hoping that, one day this practice will stop. So having the hope is helping them to cope. And some of them felt really empowered because they have been subjected to the practice, but they have been able to protect their children. So many women, here in the United States have children born here, but haven't been subjected to FGM. So that is very empowering for the survivors. And spirituality also has been used among the participant to cope. Praying help them to regulate whenever they feel dysregulated. And feeling dysregulated is something they cannot predict. It happens, you know, a simple smell can be triggering, or a type of food, or some places, or some colors can be extremely triggering. But spirituality has been extremely helpful to ground them whenever they feel dysregulated. And they had, you know, recommendations. So the question was, which kind of recommendation do you have for social workers? And many of them said, not only to social workers, the recommendations we have going to be for, you know, social workers and healthcare workers, including OBGYNs, because these are the people we interact when we're looking for services. So they recommended a lot of outreach and education, but also a lot of training. They said every single service provider who is working with survivors of female genital mutilations need to be trained on not only on why it happened, but how it impacts the survival. And they ask also for more support and understanding. So another quote from a client, from a participant, she said, providers should be more communicative, use simple expressions, and explain clearly health issues that are related to the practice. They should explain to the woman the diagnosis due to FGM. Doctors use terminologies that we do not understand. You just see all of them getting together and talking. You really don't understand what is going on. They should talk to the survivor. So these are really quotes I got from the participant, because many of them have, you know, noticed that it is very common that they go to see a service provider who doesn't take the time to explain clearly what is going on, and then they leave the doctor's office by wondering what is happening and feeling more concerned. So for now, this is what I have to share from this study. And if you have any questions, I can take. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mariama. I'm sure there are going to be a lot of questions. This, first of all, relates to a pilot study. So the question is, how do you build on that? What will, you know, happen next? And secondly, what one gets a sense of these women, you know, as you were sort of initially introducing them, you know, being of a rather conflicted mind in terms of seeing both the pain, the suffering, the injustice, but also being invested in many ways in the values of their community, and the importance therefore of that collaboration that one offers, where voices are heard, but these women are not just heard, they're listened to, are actually able to intervene, that, you know, gives them the power to actually redirect their lives, or if not their own life, but to change the lives of their daughters, the oncoming generation. So thank you very much. Comfort, we have time for a question or so, and good news indeed that Janice is back connected with us. So first of all, the question, Comfort. Please unmute, Comfort.
So sorry, I keep forgetting to unmute. Excellent that Janine is coming on, and thank you so much, Mariama. Just to, again, these are comments. Toby said, did you find out where the those who knew about FGM had gained their knowledge from? Were first-person narratives, survivor testimony mentioned? That's from Toby. I guess she can elaborate from that later on. And somebody says, anonymously said, keep in mind that FGM was part of standard American medical practice for over 130 years. Blue Shield will pay for a female circumcision until the late 1970s, which we all know. There is, this person put the link on the box. Please check that out. And another comment, someone says, white American doctors used to refer to FGM as horrific surgery. Again, there's a reference on this, and this person says, see, you can see this on Journal of Horrific Surgery, published from 1892 to 1901 as a free Google ebook. So again, I can see Mariama nodding her head. Do you want to make reference to this?
Definitely, yes. Yes, I think because of the time, we can never share everything in 15 minutes, right? So first of all, when we start talking about FGM in the US, I want people to know it is not only happening to immigrant people right here in the United States. We know women have been circumcised, mutilated in the American culture for a very, very long time. FGM exists in the white community here. And of course, Blue Shield has been covering female genital mutilation till 1976, right? So that's mean it have been happening. And the way they justified FGM here in the American culture was to, to prevent mental illness, could be, because one of the white women who have been subjected to FGM here, her first name is Renee, R-E-N-E-E. She was subjected to FGM when she was very young, maybe age of 3 in her church, because her parent found out she was masturbating. So when the parent brought this to church, they were told, the church members said, oh, we know how to solve this. And then they brought her and they mutilated her. Of course, it exists here in the United States, we know that. And if insurance companies has been covering it, that means it was justified as a medical reason. I'm sure doctors are here, help me to understand that, right? So that's why we had, a very hard time when we talking about advocating to end this practice here in the United States. And we know recently there is a case that we call the Nagarwala case that happened in Michigan here, where a doctor performed FGM on 9 girls here in the United States. But again, because of the, the type of federal law we have, the case was unfortunately dismissed, and we have issues here in the United States because of that. But again, the good side, because we always try to find something positive, right? It's because many states here have criminalized it at a state level. So even if we have the federal law that we having problems now with, because that law was found unconstitutional, people have, the option to use the legal framework at a state level.
Okay, so sorry, Comfort, you agree? We would like to continue the conversation because it widens it out into somewhat sort of unexpected and fascinating direction. The racialization, of FGM make it easier to declare it a repugnant practice in many ways. But we have now Janice happily, back with us. I've done the introduction. Janice, why don't you launch straight away into the presentation, and then we come back to Q&A. Thank you so much, Mariama and Comfort.
Thank you, Maria. I hope you can all hear me now.
Yes,
okay,
clearly.
Perfect.
Wonderfully so.
Perfect. So let me share my desktop.
Mhm.
Okay, I
Perfect.
guess you can all see my slide. Okay.
Full screen. Thank you. Perfect.
So good afternoon, everyone. And first of all, I'd really like to thank the organizers for the opportunity to present at the symposium. My presentation today will be based on the doctoral research which I have been conducting since 2016 and which I'm currently finalizing, and which also builds upon a former study I had conducted on the regulation of FGM in my home country, which is Malta. In my current PhD research, which is mainly based on legal methods, although I also use non-legal methods, such as semi-structured interviews with medical professionals, in my research, I try to identify those criteria within the legal and medical frameworks which regulate different forms of genital interventions. And I try to identify which criteria define what is legally and ethically or medically acceptable and unacceptable, and whether these criteria are clearly defined or not. But rather than speaking about these criteria today, I would like to focus my presentation also to make it more relevant to the subject of this panel, to focus it on FGM, male circumcision, and other genital interventions as markers of collective and/or of individual identity. And I would like to do this by focusing on two key questions. Namely, what do law and policy say on these practices in the UK? Because I think I forgot to mention that I will be focusing on the UK. And what were the responses of the adjudicators, particularly, of course, and medical authorities in specific cases? And also, what is the medical approach towards these practices? And I will be specifically talking about these four main types of genital practices, namely FGM, male circumcision, female genital cosmetic surgery, but this is not to exclude male genital cosmetic surgery, because it is in fact existent, but I do not really focus on that in my research. And also I will be speaking very briefly, because of time constraints, on interventions on individuals born with intersex conditions, namely with ambiguous genitalia, and individuals who identify as transgender. Now, in terms of identity, when we take FGM practices, for instance, even though these practices are condemned by WHO because they are perceived as harmful and a violation of a number of human rights of women and girls alike, in many cultures in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, the alteration of the female genitalia, particularly of young females, what is known today as FGM, is seen as a necessary procedure, as has already been discussed, marking collective and personal identity. As you know, in many cultures, FGM is often perceived as a ritual which actually confirms a person's belonging in a particular ethnic group, and at the same time is perceived as indispensable to affirm a female's gender and sexuality, so thereby acknowledging that she will eventually develop into a woman or be initiated into womanhood, wherein she will be ready for marriage and to beget children. However, it seems that some human rights activists fail to take into consideration that in many parts of the world, there are other forms of genital interventions, which, although may have serious health consequences, particularly because they involve irreversible procedures, they are also markers of individuals and/or collective identity. And the most concrete and perhaps most controversial examples are female genital cosmetic surgeries, in short, FGCS, male circumcision, also known as male genital cutting, and surgeries, genital surgeries performed on individuals born with intersex conditions, as well as gender reassignment surgeries. My point is that, like FGM, these surgeries are very much gender related because they are motivated by specific ideas on gender and sexuality, mainly because they are sought generally to affirm or reaffirm a person's gender and sexuality. And furthermore, with the exception of religious and male circumcision, the majority of these interventions are generally performed by medical professionals. Now, from a social, legal, and medical perspective, and this is oftentimes the perspective both in the literature as well as in common discourse, FGM and male circumcision are perceived as traditional forms of genital practices in the sense that they date back to times immemorial, whereas the other forms of interventions, namely female genital cosmetic surgeries and other gender identity related interventions, are more modern type of surgeries, even though one could argue that they are the new norm or the new tradition within modern culture. Now, turning to medical approaches towards FGM in the UK, first of all, in the UK, there are written medical guidelines for medical professionals for the purposes of detecting and reporting FGM cases, as well as on how to treat women with FGM. But as I said, I would like to highlight the approach of medical authorities in the UK towards FGM-related cases. And here I refer to two decisions of medical authorities in the UK, that of Dr. Abdul Baten Yalal Ahmed versus the General Medical Council, this is a 2001 case, and that of the General Medical Council versus Dr. Ali Mayo Awais of 2014. So the main question at stake in these two cases was whether these general practitioners who had allegedly offered to perform female circumcision were actually guilty of professional misconduct. And the interesting thing about these cases is whether these doctors were actually tricked, in the sense that reports were made about these doctors after a woman involved in the production of a documentary against FGM in the first case, and in the second case by a journalist, visited these doctors requesting FGM on behalf of someone else. In both cases, the adjudicating authorities found the doctors liable to serious professional misconduct and directed their names to be immediately erased from the medical register, and also prohibited them from continuing to practice within the medical profession, even though actually FGM had not been performed. So there was just the offer, but the procedure was not performed. The adjudicating authority in these cases also stated that the actions of the doctors showed a lack of any sense of professional responsibility, and it took into consideration the public interest and the protection of the public, specifically the protection of young girls. And according to the relevant authority, this outweighed the private interest of the doctors to actually continue practicing the profession. Now, from a purely legal perspective, FGM in the UK, as I think we have already heard in previous seminars, FGM in the UK is regulated by the Female Genital Mutilation Act of 2003, and there is also a specific act outlawing FGM in Scotland. And FGM is punishable by imprisonment for a term not exceeding 14 years or a fine or both on conviction on indictment, and for a term not exceeding 6 months or a fine or both on summary conviction. And however, the law provides for two main exceptions, in the sense that someone is not found criminally liable if the procedure is deemed as necessary for a girl's physical or mental health, or in cases related to labor or birth-related procedures. Now, in my research, I have identified 4 criminal cases on FGM in the UK. 3 of these resulted in an acquittal, and 1 of them in a conviction. In the first case, you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, this was the case of Dr. Dharmasena and Mr. Mohammed, a 2015 case. This was actually the first criminal case to have been prosecuted in the UK, and in fact, there was a lot of attention on this case on the media, so it received a lot of public publicity. So in this case, in circumstances of emergency, the doctor intervened surgically to perform an incision on an infibulated Somali woman because she had not been referred to the infibulation procedure prior to delivery as per the hospital's policy. And following birth, the doctor performed only a single suture to stop the bleeding. However, the prosecution claimed that by this act, the doctor intended to re-infibulate the woman and therefore to reproduce her mutilation. And therefore, the whole debate in this case revolved actually around a single suture. However, the doctor was eventually acquitted on the basis that there was actually no intention to reinstitute female genital mutilation on the woman. The other 2 cases resulted in an acquittal, and then last year there was the very first criminal conviction of R versus N, where a mother was convicted of having performed FGM on a 3-year-old daughter, and the mother was actually given an 11 years imprisonment sentence, which is actually quite a high sentence. Okay, so turning to male circumcision in the UK, historically, although not commonly practiced by locals, male circumcision has been tolerated amongst migrant communities living in the country. But today there is no specific legislation which regulates these interventions. And the procedure is commonly requested by migrants living in the country and also performed by medical professionals themselves. The UK also has specific guidelines for medical professionals when confronted with requests for such procedures. However, considering that the procedure is not specifically prohibited by law, the authoritative nature of these guidelines, one could arguably say that it is questionable. Nevertheless, the approach to these practices seems to be changing in the UK because a number of health care professionals have expressed their concern that the procedures are contrary to healthcare ethics. For example, social and political groups have also started campaigning and protesting against these practices. And here I mention a case, Buchanan versus the Crown Prosecution Service, where actually this case concerned public protests against infant male circumcision. And there was the argument put forward for the prosecution service to bring health practitioners who perform male circumcision to justice. Requests for, I'm checking how I am for time. So requests for child protection orders in the UK on the basis of male circumcision, interestingly, were generally rejected by the courts. And in some cases, judges in the family division have, on some occasions, have actually ordered the performance of male circumcision. Within the criminal sphere, however, in my research, it was not really possible to analyze whether the courts have been consistent in their approach, since the very first case on male circumcision which have reached the courts and which has led to a criminal conviction that's of a pharmacist, which I wrote also on my slide. It's the very first case happens to be a recent case, so it wasn't not really possible to identify whether there is a consistent pattern. There was also another case of disciplinary proceedings in relation to male circumcision in the UK against a doctor who performed circumcision upon the request of the grandparents and not of the parents. However, he was not criminally prosecuted, but he was brought before medical authorities who imposed a 1-month suspension on the doctor's license, since he actually failed to obtain the direct consent from the parents. But he was not prohibited from practice. And this is the case of the General Medical Council versus Dr. Balvinder Mehat, decided last year. So in both cases, the case against the pharmacist and against Dr. Mehat, in both cases, the police did not issue criminal charges against the doctor who performed the circumcision. In the case of the pharmacist, criminal charges were issued against the person, the pharmacist herself, who took the child for circumcision without the consent of the parents. But in both cases, the legitimacy of male circumcision was not contested by the adjudicating authorities. And when compared to FGM regulation, the legal approach in the UK towards male circumcision for non-therapeutic reasons, one could argue that it may appear somewhat discriminatory in nature and inconsistent. In what sense? In the sense that if legislators and law enforcers commit to protecting the right of female minors from being subjected to all forms of FGM, however slight, on the grounds that these minor girls are incapable of giving free and informed consent, it would arguably appear discriminatory not to extend such protection to male infants. Now, in regard to female genital cosmetic surgeries in the UK, and I'm coming slowly towards the end of my presentation. So these type of surgeries are becoming increasingly popular in North America, Australia, and Europe, and typically they are performed on adults. So the UK, it has explanatory notes, right, which explains to the UK and Scottish legal acts, and these notes list these type of surgery as an example of genital mutilation, which could, however, be excusable and justified on mental health grounds. Specifically, they state cosmetic surgery resulting from the distress caused by a perception of abnormality. And this exception was tested in the UK case of Professor David Buehler, who is a leading consultant psychiatrist, and Dr. Joe Daniels, a surgeon, who were put under a 3-year investigation for their involvement in a clitoris removal operation on an adult married woman, which appeared to breach the UK Act. And these doctors argued that the surgery was deemed to be motivated by purely cosmetic and aesthetic considerations. And eventually, however, the Crown Prosecution Services, although they initiated investigations, these 2 doctors were not prosecuted. And then there was another interesting case in the UK related to cosmetic surgeries that against Dr. Pandya. But these were disciplinary proceedings before the medical authorities. And this concerned a doctor who removed almost all of the labia minora of a patient during what was described as a cosmetic surgery. The patient in this case was an adult woman, and following surgery, she went to another doctor complaining about the surgery, that it was not performed well, and that she felt circumcised, as though someone had performed FGM on her. The medical tribunal, however, decided in favor of the doctor, and it said that it decided that the doctor found that he had no intention of performing FGM, and in fact, no sanctions were imposed. And lastly, a few words on interventions related to gender assignment and reassignment surgeries. So, first of all, medical interventions on intersex have traditionally been performed by medical professionals in order to modify ambiguous genitalia and other sex characteristics, that is, to assign a specific gender to a person, as well as to reduce the likelihood of future problems. On the other hand, gender or sex reassignment surgeries date back to the early 20th century and are today considered as part of treatment for gender identity problems, whenever a person wishes to alter his or her sex characteristics to perform to their self-perceived gender identity. However, interestingly, from an anatomical perspective, these surgeries often involve similar procedures to those involved in cosmetic or culturally motivated forms of FGM and male circumcision. And in the UK, genital interventions on intersex, they remain legal to date, as well as those on people identifying as transgender, although criticized by some activists. So these services, these interventions are currently being offered, particularly interventions on individuals identifying as transgender. They are offered by the National Health Service gender identity clinics. Although, as I said, there is currently criticism against specific reassignment interventions on children on the basis that these children are not of age to give free and informed consent, and this is currently being challenged in courts. So in conclusion, as you can see, the legal and medical frameworks towards these interventions there are actually a number of differences, mainly because of the perceptions and the motivations perceived by the legislators and adjudicators, their perceptions of these interventions. And I would like to conclude there with my email address, and thank you very much for your attention.